more than 6 centuries ago, in the midst of one of the longest and most brutal conflicts in European history, an unexpected figure emerged. A teenage girl, not a noble, not a soldier. Her name was Joan of Arc. To this day, her story continues to spark debate. Some believe that she was truly chosen by God, receiving divine visions that guided her. Others see her as a product of psychological pressure, extreme religiosity, or the political constructs of her time. Yet, one thing is difficult to deny. How could a peasant girl, without military training, without power, manage to alter the course of a great war? At around 17 years old, Joan stepped onto the stage of history, not as an official commander, but as a symbol of figure who ignited hope, faith, and courage. Her life was short. She was executed before reaching the age of 20. Yet within such a limited time, she became a catalyst that changed the course of French history. Remarkable, isn't it? Shh. Let us begin at the beginning. Joan of Arc was born around 1412 in the small village of Domremy, a border region in northeastern France. This was not a peaceful place. Domremy lay in a conflict-prone zone, near the lines of tension between rival factions. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, and her mother, Isabelle Romée, were simple peasants. She grew up with her siblings in a rural life that was harsh, yet stable. Like most women of her time, Joan received no formal education in reading or writing. However, she was raised in a deeply religious environment. Her mother was known for her piety, and it was from her that Joan learned prayer, faith, and conviction elements that would later define all her actions. From a young age, she also witnessed firsthand the effects of war displacement, fear, and the constant threat of sudden attacks. The world that shaped Joan was not a peaceful one. It was a world filled with uncertainty. When Joan was born, France had long been entangled in a massive conflict known as the 100 Years' War. This war was not merely about territory. It was a dynastic struggle, a contest for the legitimacy of the throne, and a broader fight for power between England and France. For decades, the war devastated French lands. English forces were known for employing the tactic of chevauchée, fast-moving raids that burned villages, destroyed crops, and crippled local economies. Their military superiority was further reinforced by the use of longbow archers, which proved deadly in major engagements such as the Battle of Agincourt. As a result, by the early 15th century, France was in a severely weakened position. Defeat after defeat had eroded the confidence of both its nobility and its people. Amid this crisis, France was ruled by Charles VI of France. However, the king suffered from severe episodic mental illness, often rendering him incapable of governing. This power vacuum triggered internal conflict. Two major figures emerged as rivals: Louis of Orléans, John the Fearless. Their rivalry ended in tragedy. In 1407, Louis was assassinated on the orders of John the Fearless, an event that ignited open civil war. France split into two major factions: Armagnacs, supporters of Orléans, Burgundians. One key figure of the Armagnac faction was Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac, who led resistance against Burgundy. France was no longer only fighting an external enemy, it was collapsing from within. Seeing this division, Henry V of England seized the opportunity. He launched a major invasion of France and achieved a series of significant victories. In 1418, Paris fell to the Burgundian faction. Many Armagnac supporters were massacred in the brutal upheaval. The alliance between Burgundy and England further strengthened the English position. For the first time, the possibility that France might fall entirely under English control was no longer a distant threat, but an approaching reality. In 1420, a treaty was signed that shook the foundations of the French monarchy, the Treaty of Troyes. This agreement declared that the French throne would pass to Henry V and his heirs, not to the king's legitimate son. That son was Charles VII of France, who was effectively disinherited. when Henry V and Charles VI died within a short span of time. Henry V's son, Henry VI of England, became king of both realms, at least by claim. Meanwhile, Charles VII controlled only a small portion of territory in the south. France now stood on the brink of collapse. In 1428, the city of Orléans, one of the last strongholds loyal to Charles VII, was besieged by English forces. This siege was no ordinary battle. If Orléans fell, the road to the south would open, and most likely all of France would come under English control. This was an existential crisis. The fate of a kingdom now depended on a single city. In the midst of this despair, stories and hopes began to circulate. Some chronicles mention beliefs that France would one day be saved by an unexpected figure. However, modern historians caution that many of these prophecies were likely constructed after the fact, narratives shaped following Joan's emergence to reinforce her legitimacy. This means that between fact and legend, the boundary is often blurred, and it is precisely within this gray area that the story of Joan of Arc was born. From a small border village, from a humble peasant family in the midst of war, betrayal, and despair, a girl would emerge. A girl with no power, yet one who would shake a kingdom. And the world would remember her name, Joan of Arc. From an early age, the life of Joan of Arc was simple, almost indistinguishable from that of other village children in medieval Europe. Her days were filled with domestic work, weaving cloth, sewing garments, cleaning the house, and helping tend livestock. She knew no luxury. There was no formal education like that enjoyed by noble children. Yet this does not mean she grew up without knowledge. In her home, there was one thing that was taught with great emphasis: faith. Her mother, Isabelle Romé, was known as a pious woman. It was from her that Joan learned prayers, church rituals, and the basic teachings of Christianity. Although illiterate, Joan possessed a deep religious understanding, a form of spiritual intelligence that would later become the core of her entire life's journey. She regularly attended Mass at the village church, and like many people of her time, she lived in a world where religion was not merely belief, but daily reality. No one could have imagined that from such a simple life, a figure would emerge who would shake history. According to Joan's own testimony, later recorded in documents such as the Trial of Joan of Arc, this extraordinary experience began when she was still a young teenager, around the age of 13. One day, while near her family's garden, she claimed to see a bright light coming from the direction of the church. The light was so intense that it startled and frightened her. From within that light, Joan stated that she saw holy figures. She identified them as Michael the Archangel, Catherine of Alexandria, Margaret of Antioch. According to her account, these figures did not come to frighten her, but to guide her. They spoke gently, delivering messages that she initially struggled to understand. For many people of that time, such experiences were not entirely unfamiliar. The medieval world was one in which the boundary between the divine and the real often felt thin. However, for modern historians, these experiences remain a subject of debate. Were they divine revelations or psychological experiences later interpreted through a religious framework? The answer remains open. Over time, according to Joan's testimony, the voices became clearer. They gave her a mission, not a small one, nor something that could be ignored. She believed that God commanded her to expel the English army from French lands, help bring Charles VII of France to his official coronation in Reims. For a peasant girl who had never left her village, this task sounded impossible. Yet Joan did not doubt it. In later testimonies, she stated that she trusted these voices completely, just as she trusted in the existence of God himself. It is important to understand, Joan did not see herself as a military leader in the traditional sense. She believed herself to be an instrument, a messenger of divine will, and it was precisely this belief that gave her extraordinary courage. At first, Joan kept these experiences to herself, but the visions continued to recur. Their message grew more urgent. At the same time, the situation in France worsened. The siege of Orléans by English forces pushed the kingdom's future to the brink of collapse. Within this context of crisis, Joan's belief turned into action. She began speaking to those around her about her mission. The reactions she received were mixed. Many doubted her. Some considered her strange. Yet others began to see something different, an unwavering conviction even in the face of rejection. And that conviction was contagious. At last, Joan took her first major step. She traveled to the town of Vaucouleurs to meet the local commander, Robert de Baudricourt. Her goal was clear. She wanted to be escorted to meet the Dauphin, Charles VII. But the first meeting did not go as she had hoped. Baudricourt rejected her request. To him, Joan was merely a village girl with unbelievable claims. Yet Joan did not give up. She returned, and returned again. With each rejection, her conviction only grew stronger. Some began to support her, including two knights, Jean de Metz, Bertrand de Poulengy. They saw something in Joan, not merely words, but an unshakable belief. At one point, Joan reportedly made a bold statement that French forces would soon suffer a defeat. Not long after, news of such a defeat indeed arrived, likely referring to the Battle of the Herrings. Was this truly a prophecy, or a coincidence later amplified by storytelling? As with many parts of Joan's story, the answer is uncertain, but the impact was real. For the first time, Baudricourt began to consider that this girl might not be ordinary. At last, a decision was made. Joan would be escorted to Chinon, where Charles VII resided. This was no ordinary journey. It spanned hundreds of kilometers through territories filled with enemies, bandits, and danger. For protection, Joan wore men's clothing, an act that, at the time, violated both social and religious norms. Yet it was a risk she had to take. Accompanied by a small group of loyal supporters, a peasant girl from a small village now rode on horseback toward the center of power, toward a king, toward a war, toward her destiny. Several individuals who had begun to believe in her mission assisted her, providing a horse, equipment, and protection. If she had been captured along the way, her fate would likely have ended before her story truly began. Yet Joan pressed forward. She was convinced, or at least believed, that she was carrying out a will greater than herself. And at last, she arrived in Chinon. There, her destiny would be tested. News of a peasant girl claiming divine mission had reached Charles VII of France. He was intrigued, yet filled with doubt. To test Joan, Charles is said to have devised a scenario. According to several later chronicles, he disguised himself as a nobleman and stood among the crowd in the Great Hall, while another person pretended to be him. The purpose was simple. If Joan were truly guided by divine power, she should be able to recognize the Dauphin. When Joan entered the room, all eyes were on her. She walked past the nobles. Then, according to several sources, she went directly to the disguised Charles and greeted him with respect. This moment is often regarded as evidence of her exceptional nature. However, modern historians remain cautious. There is no definitive proof that the event occurred exactly as described. It is possible Joan had been given prior hints, or that she was able to read the social dynamics of the room. Whatever the truth, one thing is clear: this encounter was enough for Charles to consider that Joan deserved further examination. The decision to trust Joan was not a simple one. She was not a noble, nor a church authority. She was a peasant girl making extraordinary claims. Therefore, she had to undergo a series of tests. One of the first steps was a physical examination conducted by court women under the supervision of Yolande of Aragon. The purpose was to confirm that Joan was a virgin, a symbol of purity that held great importance in the religious context of the time. The result aligned with Joan's claims. Yet this examination was not only about morality, but also a reflection of social control over women in medieval society. A far more significant test took place in Poitiers. There, Joan was examined by theologians and church authorities in what is now known as the Portier's Inquiry. Over several weeks, she was questioned about her faith and beliefs, the nature of her visions, the purpose of her mission. The theologians sought to answer a central question: was Joan inspired by God or by something else? Interestingly, no complete record of this examination survives today. However, the outcome is known. They found no evidence that Joan was engaging in deception or sorcery. Yet they also did not explicitly declare her mission to be divine. The conclusion was cautious. There was no strong reason to reject her. And in a time of crisis such as that faced by France, that was enough. With support beginning to form, Joan took a bold step. She sent a letter to the English, addressed to Henry VI of England and their commanders in France. In the letter, Joan declared that she had been sent by God. She demanded that the English leave French lands. If not, she warned that they would face great consequences. This letter was not merely diplomatic communication. It was a declaration, a statement of identity, mission. Joan signed it as L'Épouse, the Maid, a title that not only described her personal status, but also constructed a symbolic image: purity, legitimacy, and divine authority. Now, Joan was no longer merely a girl with claims. She had become part of a military plan. She was given armor, specially made for her body. She rode a horse, often described as white, a symbol of leadership and purity. Yet most important was her banner. Not merely a flag, but a symbol of her mission. According to sources, it displayed the name Jesus Maria, images of Christ and angels, the fleur-de-lis, symbol of the French monarchy. Interestingly, Joan herself claimed she preferred carrying her banner rather than a sword. She did not see herself as a killer, but as a messenger. She was there to lead, but not by the force of weapons alone. With all preparations complete, Joan's first objective was set: to liberate Orléans. Yet not everyone was convinced. Some nobles saw her as hope. Others saw her as a risk. There were even those who quietly thought, if she failed, the problem would resolve itself. But for Joan, the doubts of others did not matter. She held only one conviction: that she had been called. And now, she was ready to answer that call. When Joan of Arc arrived in Orléans in 1429, the city was on the verge of collapse. For months, it had been under siege in what is known as the Siege of Orléans. English forces had constructed a series of fortifications around the city, aiming to cut off supplies and weaken its defenses. Yet the siege was not entirely airtight. There remained limited routes through which aid could still enter, though at great risk. Inside the city, the situation was critical. Supplies were running low. Troop morale was declining. Civilian hope was fading. For many, the fall of Orléans seemed only a matter of time. Joan's arrival did not immediately change everything. French commanders, including Jean de Dunois, one of the key leaders of the city's defense, initially remained cautious. Their hesitation was understandable. Joan was not a noble. She had no formal military experience, and her claim that she was sent by God was extraordinary. Yet Joan brought something no one else possessed: an unshakable conviction. She did not take over military command. Strategy remained in the hands of experienced leader. But she did something equally important: she changed how they fought. Joan encouraged bolder, more aggressive action. She rejected the defensive posture that had dominated until then, and gradually, the spirit of the troops began to change. Joan did not remain behind the lines. She stood at the front, not as a tactical commander, but as a living symbol. With her banner in hand, she moved among the soldiers, inspiring them with strong religious conviction. She invoked the name of God, and for many soldiers, that gave meaning to their struggle. Within days, French forces began launching attacks against English positions surrounding the city. These assaults were not without risk, but for the first time, they were no longer merely defending, they were attacking. In one of the fiercest assaults directed toward a key fortification south of the Loire, Joan was wounded. An arrow struck her shoulder. She was pulled back from the battlefield. For many, it seemed like a bad omen, but the story did not end there. After receiving treatment, Joan returned. Her presence, even while wounded, had a powerful psychological effect. French troops saw that she did not retreat, and that alone was enough to keep them advancing. The climax of the fighting came with the assault on the fortress of Les Tourelles, one of the most important English defensive positions. This stronghold controlled strategic access to the city. The battle was intense, but in the end, French forces captured it. This victory became a tactical turning point. Without Les Tourelles, the English position at Orléans became highly vulnerable. A few days after the fall of the fortress, English forces began to withdraw. The siege that had lasted for months came to an end. This was not a total destruction of English forces, but they could no longer maintain their position. Orléans had been liberated, and for the first time in a long while, France achieved a major victory. This victory had consequences far beyond the battlefield. Militarily, it opened the path for a series of further operations in the Loire Valley, now known as the Loire Campaign. Yet its greatest impact was psychological. For the first time in years, the French people saw that the English could be defeated. Confidence in Charles VII of France began to recover, and Joan's name spread across the land. On the English side, perceptions also shifted. If she had once been a subject of ridicule, she was now seen as a threat, even, by some, as something unnatural. After the victory at Orléans, Joan did not stop. For her, this was only the first step. She urged Charles VII to be crowned at Reims, the traditional site of French royal coronations. Many of the king's advisors hesitated. The journey to Reims meant crossing dangerous territory. Yet momentum was on their side. Victory after victory along the Loire opened the path. And finally, on July 17, 1429, a pivotal event in French history took place. The coronation of Charles VII at Reims Cathedral. There, Joan stood, holding the same banner she had carried into battle. The moment was more than ceremony. It was a symbolic victory. Charles's legitimacy was strengthened, and Joan's mission seemed nearly fulfilled. After the coronation of Charles VII of France at Reims in 1429, for many, the mission of Joan of Arc seemed complete. She had helped lift the siege of Orléans. She had witnessed the Dauphin become king. Yet for Joan, the struggle was not over. England still controlled parts of France, and as long as they remained, the war was not truly finished. Here, differences began to emerge. For Joan, this was a divine calling that had to be fulfilled. But for Charles VII, the situation had changed. He was now a legitimate king. And as king, he had to consider more than battlefield victory, politics, diplomacy, and long-term stability. After Reims, the direction of French strategy began to shift. Joan urged continued offensive action, especially toward Paris, which at the time was under Burgundian control, allied with England. However, many of the king's advisors disagreed. War required immense resources. The political risks were high. And for Charles VII, who had just secured legitimacy, losing momentum could be far more dangerous than restraint. In September 1429, an attack on Paris was finally launched, but the result was disappointing. The assault failed, and during the battle, Joan was wounded once again. This failure marked a turning point. The momentum that had once been so powerful began to fade. After the failed attack on Paris, support for Joan began to shift. She was not entirely abandoned, but her influence was no longer as strong as before. Some troops were dismissed. Military operations became more limited. Joan now stood in a difficult position. On one hand, she remained a symbol of hope. On the other, she was no longer at the center of royal strategy. Yet she did not stop. With a smaller force, she continued the struggle, because for Joan, her mission was not yet complete. In 1430, Joan went to the town of Compiègne, which was under threat from Burgundian forces. During a battle outside the city, the situation shifted rapidly. French forces were forced to retreat. In the chaos of withdrawal, Joan remained in the rear guard, the most dangerous position. It was there that she was captured. She was taken by Burgundian forces under the authority of nobles such as John of Luxembourg. For Joan, this was a turning point. For her enemies, it was an opportunity. After her capture, Joan was not immediately handed over to the English. She became a political prisoner. But not long after, she was sold to the English. For them, Joan was not merely a captive of war. She was a symbol. As long as she lived and remained free, she inspired France. But if she could be discredited, if she could be proven a fraud or a heretic, then the legitimacy she had helped build could collapse. And with it, the legitimacy of Charles VII of France. Once in English hands, charges were prepared. Joan was not to be tried as an ordinary prisoner of war. She would face a religious trial. The primary accusation was heresy. Several elements were used against her. Her claim of hearing divine voices, her belief that she was sent by God, her wearing of men's clothing. In the medieval context, all of these could be considered serious offenses. More than that, they could justify a death sentence. A major question arises: why was Joan not rescued? Historically, there is no clear evidence that Charles VII actively betrayed her. Yet there is also no record of a significant effort to free her. Was this a political decision, a limitation of power, or a more complex calculation? Historians continue to debate this. To this day, what is certain, Joan faced her fate, almost alone. Joan was moved from one location to another. At one point, she was held at Beaurevoir Castle. There, in a moment of desperation, she attempted to escape. She leapt from a high tower, an act that could easily have been fatal. This event is known as the Joan of Arc's leap from Beaurevoir, yet remarkably, she survived. She was soon recaptured. Eventually, Joan was transferred to the city of Rouen, the center of English power in France. There, she would stand trial. Formally, this was an ecclesiastical court, but in practice, the proceedings were heavily influenced by English political interests. The trial was led by Pierre Cauchon, a bishop aligned with the English cause. The purpose of the trial was not merely to determine Joan's guilt. More than that, it aimed to destroy her legitimacy. If Joan could be proven a heretic, then everything she had done, including the coronation of Charles VII of France, would lose its moral foundation. The trial lasted for months. Joan was interrogated repeatedly, both in the courtroom and in her cell. The questions were not simple. The judges attempted to trap her, forcing her to admit that the voices she heard came from the devil. Yet Joan demonstrated something remarkable. She was not only brave, she was also intelligent. On many occasions, she refused to answer questions she considered inappropriate. When asked about matters she believed known only to God, she firmly stated that she would not reveal them. In one of the most famous moments, she warned the judges that if they judged her unjustly, they would be held accountable before God. A young girl without formal education stood before experienced theologians and did not falter. The primary accusation against Joan was not merely sorcery. She was charged with heresy. Several points were used against her: claiming to receive direct revelation from God without church authority, refusing full submission to ecclesiastical authority, wearing men's clothing considered a violation of religious norms. For the court, this was not a minor offense, it was a threat to the religious order. If proven guilty, the punishment for heresy was death. Under immense pressure, Joan was given a choice. She was asked to sign an abjuration, an admission of error and submission to the church. If she refused, she would be executed immediately. Under this pressure, Joan eventually signed the document. For a moment, she avoided execution, but that decision would not last. A few days later, the situation changed. Joan resumed wearing men's clothing. The reason remains debated, whether for protection in prison or because she reaffirmed her convictions. But for the court, this was enough. Her action was considered a relapse heresy, a return to error after repentance. Under medieval church law, this was a far more serious offense. At this time, there was no return. Joan was declared a relapsed heretic. Her sentence, death. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was brought to the marketplace in Rouen. A stake had been prepared. Before a large crowd, she was tied and surrounded by firewood. As the flames began to rise, Joan did not yield to fear. She asked for a cross. A priest held it before her, so she could see it until her final moments. Amid the flames, she continued to call upon the name of God. Her voice was heard until it finally faded. After the execution, Joan's body was not left intact. It was burned again until reduced to ashes. Those ashes were then cast into the Seine River. The intention was clear: no grave, no relics, no site of pilgrimage. They sought to ensure that Joan's story would end there. But they were wrong. The fire may have consumed her body, but not her name. From a village girl to the accused, to a martyr. The story of Joan of Arc did not end in Rouen. From her death, a legend was born, one that could not be extinguished. The death of Joan of Arc in 1431 was indeed tragic. Yet it was after her death that questions began to arise. Was her trial truly just? Was she truly guilty, or merely a victim of politics? Among the people, doubt began to grow. Even within the church, not everyone was fully convinced by the verdict that had been delivered. The seeds of rehabilitation had begun to take root. Over time, the political situation shifted. Charles VII of France grew stronger. English power in France gradually weakened. In this context, a new need emerged, not only to win the war, but also to restore past legitimacy. Because if Joan were truly a heretic, then Charles's coronation, supported by her, could be called into question. Thus, clearing Joan's name also strengthened the king's position. It is important to understand this was not purely an emotional act. It was at once political, religious, and symbolic. In the 1450s, a process of reinvestigation began. Its peak came in 1456, in what is known as the retrial of Joan of Arc. This inquiry involved dozens of witnesses, including Joan's family, villagers from her hometown, former soldiers, even individuals who had interacted with her. Her mother, Isabelle Romay, was present to defend her daughter's name. Testimony after testimony revealed a different picture. Joan was not a witch, not a fraud. She was a simple girl, devout, and full of conviction. The result was striking yet confirmed many suspicions. The 1431 trial was declared flawed. It had been marked by political bias, unjust procedures, pressure from the English. The verdict was annulled. Joan's name was restored. From a heretic, she was now recognized as a victim of injustice. As a form of remembrance, a cross was erected at the site of her execution in Rouen. The place of her death became a symbol of restoration. After her name was cleared, Joan's legacy grew far beyond her lifetime. She became a symbol of courage, sacrifice, loyalty to the nation. Centuries later, figures such as Napoleon Bonaparte revived her image as a symbol of French nationalism. In times of crisis, her name would re-emerge, not only as a historical figure, but as an enduring source of inspiration. Centuries after her death, the Catholic Church reconsidered Joan's status. The process was long. It involved investigations into her life, as well as reports of miracles attributed to her intercession. In 1909, Joan was beatified, and finally, in 1920, she was officially declared a saint by Pope Benedict XV. Since then, she has been known as Saint Joan of Arc. Her feast day is observed on May 30th, the day of her death. The story of Joan of Arc is a historical paradox. She held no power. She had no formal education. She did not come from the elite, yet she altered the course of a war, influenced the legitimacy of a kingdom, and left a legacy that endures for centuries. From a village girl to a military leader, to the accused, to a martyr, and finally a saint, the story of Joan of Arc is not merely about war. It is a story of faith, of courage in the face of doubt, and of how one person without power, without status, can change the course of history. She may have died in Rouen, but her name has never truly faded.